right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. David Christian, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of History and Archaeology and former director of the Big History Institute at Macquarie University. Additionally, he was the founding president of the International Big History Association, wrote the first published monograph on Big History, and is a co-founder of the Big History Project. Lastly, he is also the author of many books on Big History. So, Dr. Christian, thanks for coming on today.
Pleasure.
So, when did you first get interested in history?
In history, it's kind of strange because I was never terribly good at history at school, and I was taught a kind of, history as a sequence of facts. I think probably just before university, and it's kind of strange that I chose history because in many ways I was more interested in science.
Okay.
And I think eventually that interest eventually surfaced again,
Yeah.
of course, when you get a historian sort of trying to teach about Big Bang cosmology and things like that.
Right. Okay, fair enough. And so then what were exactly the origins of big history then as a field and, your work?
You know how you tend to mythologize your own changes in your own thinking. From my own point of view, I taught Russian history for many years. By training, I'm a Russian historian. My first job was in Russian history. And during the Cold War, Russia seemed really important. I felt it was really important to be trying to give more than a caricatured understanding of Russia to young Australians. But eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia ceased to be so significant, and the Soviet Union ceased to be so significant, although it's now significant for all the wrong reasons again. And I think I'd always had a feeling that history is not just about the past, it should be about the deepest and most meaningful questions of all. So my colleagues thought I was going through a sort of midlife crisis, but what happened in the mid to late 80s was that I began toying with the idea of how big should history be. No world history was taught in Australia at that time, so I didn't know about the idea of world history, which was much more familiar in the States. So I thought maybe you could teach about the whole history of humanity. So I think we're in a globalized world where 8 billion humans are in more and more ways interlinked, and their fate is interlinked. So I thought we should really be teaching histories of humanity, not of Russians or of Australians or Americans or Chinese people. And then I thought, how do you teach the history of humanity? Well, you'd have to begin by talking about how humans evolved. So you'd have to talk about biology. And then once you start doing that, you have to talk about how primates evolved, how mammals evolved. So that means talking about the whole history of life on Earth. And these questions dragged me further and further and further. And then I thought, well, then I have to talk about the planet itself. How did it come to exist? Why is it life-friendly? And that led me to think about, the sun and the solar system and the origins of the whole universe. So I began thinking, I wonder if it's possible to teach history, to teach the whole of history.
Right.
Going back as far as you could. I mean, there's a kind of extremist project, and I think my colleagues, very nice people, but they thought this was just a bit weird and extremist. But I was really attracted by this idea. And eventually I started putting together ideas about what a course might look like. And I thought some students, at least, are going to find this very exciting. And through a series of bureaucratic accidents, my colleagues were all looking for someone willing to take on a large first-year course. And I stuck up my hand, and no one else did. And so I think what they did was they were really worried about this, but they thought, okay, let's give it a go. And from the start, it attracted huge numbers of students from many disciplines, as you can imagine. I recruited lecturers from many different fields. And for the first few years, I had no idea what I was doing. Really, I mean, we got lectures from astronomers, geologists, biologists, and then archaeologists, historians. And they didn't quite fit together because each specialist talked in the jargon of their own discipline.
Okay.
What was really exciting for me was over several years, this is in the early 90s, I sat in on all the lectures, of course, and I began giving more and more of them. I saw a coherent story emerging, and the language for that story, language that would cross all the disciplines. And eventually I convinced myself, I didn't convince a lot of other people, but I convinced myself that there was a coherent story here, that it was a very powerful story, and that it had something of the power of traditional religious stories, origin stories, because it was a story about everything. And as an educator, I believe strongly, passionately, that at some point in their careers, students need to encounter stories about everything. I mean, of course, they all do, but very, very often they encounter religious stories set within different religious traditions. So they know of some people whose story is different. So my idea was science, insofar as people commit to it, is a global language. I mean, if you're a scientist in Beijing or you're a scientist in Durban, you talk basically the same language. So is it possible to tell a similar story of origins that's set within the thinking of modern science? I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-religion. I mean, it can, you know, a story like this is bound to borrow a lot from religious traditions, but it is going to differ from them in many ways. For example, as a scientific account of the history of the Earth, I will argue that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not 6,000 years old. You know,
Right.
so that's a very long answer to your question, Ben.
No, but I mean, it's good because it's the details there that matter and help shape, you know, what exactly is going on with big history. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, people need some type of story to kind of understand, you know, where they come from. And the good news is that, you know, the big history story is a story that's based on evidence and not based on, you know, just religious ideas that are being passed down, you know, kind of blindly. Because I mean, even when people are thinking about just their families, you know, you talk about your family story, your family history, where did your family come from? So it's a kind of a human element of understanding, I suppose, sort of the big picture of, you know, how we got here. And it's very, very cool and interesting, I think, and inspiring in many ways.
There's a set of Matryoshka dolls that begins with "Who am I? What's my origin?
Right.
What's my family? Who's my clan or tribe or nation? Who's humanity?" And within that set of Matryoshka dolls, eventually you get to the biggest of them all. But each of those ways of framing the story can give you insights into other ways of framing the story. And I think one of the big problems today is that so many people are caught between competing stories. And that leads to a lot of sort of existential confusion. And it may be that I've been adding to that existential confusion, but in a global world, you cannot escape the fact that different people have committed to different origin stories.
Oh yes.
And
Yeah.
you know, my bet is simply on the future of an origin story based on modern science, an origin story for the modern world. And once again, I repeat, that doesn't mean pushing away religious traditions. It means pushing away some of the details of those traditions, but it doesn't mean pushing away many of their ethical insights or moral insights.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the interesting things then that I'm curious to talk about with you, and that's just kind of comparing, you know, I guess what one could call like sort of the more traditional history that people have been taught compared to like big history. And, you know, obviously sort of the more traditional history we'll have, you know, we'll talk about kind of the nitty gritty details of some aspects of human societies and civilization that big history may not really go into in depth as
That's
much
right.
on.
Yeah, I mean, a big, you know, you can think of the work historians do. Most of the work professional historians do, and I've been a professional historian, you know, that's been my career.
Yeah.
Clusters around a particular group of Matryoshka dolls. And those really, in the last century or two, that cluster, the best way I can describe it is by saying it's dominated by the national scale, the scale of a nation state. The personal scale, the biographical scale is very important. Sometimes a slightly larger civilizational scale is important. World history goes to the next scale, but even most world history is not actually about humanity. It's about the modern world. You look at the syllabi. I believe the AP world history courses in the States have now cut everything before 1200, which I have to say appalls me. Absolutely
Yeah,
appalls
me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty disturbing. I mean, my master's was in a combination of big history and ancient studies, so that pretty much leaves me out of it. And it's I think especially and beyond that, I mean, I've always found that the AP classes also don't really teach history from my experiences because it's mostly just regurgitating facts on paper and a lot of memorization. Which it's great if you can memorize, you know, random bits of history, but you don't actually understand anything when you're spitting it out on test.
I mean, I suppose I've always felt, I've always been fascinated by the big existential questions. I'm not religious in a conventional sense, despite my surname. I mean, I grew up in a sort of Anglican tradition, but I think as a late teenager, just all the logical contradictions in it
Sure.
just got me. And I never went back to it. And I was never. I mean, I adore religious music. So, I'm still seduced by some aspects of traditional religion. When I say religious music, that includes, by the way, sort of some aspects of Muslim music. It's not
Sure.
just
Yeah.
the Christian tradition. But yeah, it just didn't work for me. For some people, it clearly works. Those stories are still inspirational. They help them think about the most fundamental things. For me, it never did. So I felt I had to look for a story within science that could help me think as deeply about all the big existential questions as religious traditions do. And I believe that if you're teaching history, one of your jobs is to use history as a vehicle for helping students to ask about where is it all going? I mean, today particularly, that's an absolutely riveting question for young people.
Yeah.
They if you're 20 now, you're thinking, in my 50s, will I be in a world in decline? Is there anything I can do now to change that? So yeah, so that's one of the reasons I love big history. It's a very powerful vehicle for, partly because it's unfamiliar to many people, for thinking
Yeah.
about the deepest possible questions about existence, why we're here, is there meaning to the universe? All of those wonderful, deep questions that I think every young person ought to be asking and ought to be encouraged to ask.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just has it's kind of it's basically relevant to everyone's life, in ways that just a normal history class isn't, because it's something, I don't know any person that at some point in their life isn't thinking about these big questions like, why are we here? Where do we come from? That's just kind of, I think, human nature of trying to understand your existence in the first place. And big history is something that talks about that, while, lots of history classes, obviously, most history classes would never touch on such a subject. A religious class might, but, that's the thing. So,
and it's strangely in the 19th century. I mean, it's now very conventional among historians to be very critical of 19th century historians, and quite rightly in many ways. They were racist, they were
sure.
chauvinists, they were, all those things I agree with. But one thing that they did was they always kept sight of these very big questions. And all the big thinkers of the 19th century had their eye on those questions. The answers they gave may be ones that just don't work today, but they had their eye on those questions. And somehow or other, many of the humanities disciplines, even though the word human is built into the idea of humanities, lost sight of the idea of humanity and the question, what is our species? What sort of creature are we? Why are we so powerful that we can change a planet, which is what we're doing
Yeah.
right now? What is it about us? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I guess one of the disappointing things that I feel like for a lot of students when they get into a history classroom is just finding it kind of maybe too specialized on certain subjects, and you're getting so deep in the weeds of a topic that you just can't follow it, and you're very bored. As a result, you walk away not liking history. And that's when it's something that's so relevant to people's lives, the whole world is shaped on those that came before us, and when we're making decisions about things, obviously having a good understanding of the past is a crucial aspect to making good decisions for the future. But I feel like in many ways, the way that history is taught has turned off a lot of people. And I mean, we see this with, record declines in the US and the number of history majors, for example. It's just, and people just don't see it as being useful. And, I think that's detrimental to society in the long run.
Yeah, and I agree. My own idea, I couldn't prove it really, is that one of the reasons for the decline of interest in the humanities is that they used to be useful in a kind of philosophical sense, an existential sense, that they were powerful ways of helping you think about deep questions. Science is very good at sort of technical things, helping you do things. It's often less good at helping you think about deep existential issues, and the humanities were really good at that. But what happened, I think, maybe is they tried to imitate the sciences. They sort of narrowed the scale of questions they asked, and they stopped asking those questions. So they don't give you the technical skills that scientists acquire, but no longer do they give you the existential skills that, of course, in theology, might begin to give you, or in some forms of philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think humanities, in many ways, they narrowed their scope, partially perhaps in an attempt to imitate the success of the sciences. And so no wonder they've I think have lost their way. But having said that, what happened in the 20th century is that we got a kind of definition of what's real history. And to use the metaphor I've used already, you know, of sort of 20 Matryoshka dolls, real history focuses on 4 or 5 or 6 of them. And many people do love just the details, and they are a bit nervous about the big existential questions. And I think that helps explain partly the resistance to big history. You said it yourself. Many people, if you do big history, you know, you won't learn about the American Civil War. It's too small an event.
Yeah.
And many people think, how can you do a history course without learning about the American Civil War? Because they have this very clear idea of the scale at which history operates. So there's huge resistance to big history. And I naively thought that when I began teaching it, that, you know, everyone's going to think, wow, what a great way of thinking about the past. You know, surely every student at some point in their career should do a big history course. Then they can go back, you know, they could look at the other Matryoshka dolls, but they'll always be aware that the particular Matryoshka doll they're looking at is one of many.
Right.
That each of those scales has something to say to the other scales. But there's huge resistance to big history. I think personally, I think it's kind of sad, but I've slowly over the years become aware of how great is the resistance. And among professional historians, of course, their ideas, their self-identity is bound up, sense of what is real history.
Yeah.
And so many of them think of something like big history as sort of play history,
Okay.
not quite serious, not quite the real thing. And you know, obviously, I just find that very sad.